There's a lot of offensive content out there, and whether we should read it or not is something frequently debated in the online book community. Some say we should avoid certain books and authors, and others say don't be such a big baby about it. But here's the truth, if you read books or watch movies or spend more than a minute on the internet, you will encounter something offensive. It's inevitable. So the question is not, should we read offensive books? The real question is, what do we do when we encounter something offensive? How do we engage with this sort of content? Why is it offensive? How should we react? What can we learn from this? And how can we think about it further to fully understand the topic? In many ways, today's video is about a form of analysis called critical reading and how to apply it to offensive content. Because this is not a simple topic. I learned that the hard way. When I chose this topic for today's video, I thought it would be a short, simple, and fun topic. It was not short, it was not simple, and it was not fun. Because everything's offensive to someone. It's all very subjective, it's very hard to pin down exactly what offensive content is, and what are the pros and cons of engaging with it, the ethical ramifications. It's all a lot, but we're going to attempt to discuss it all today. Because this is such a complex topic, I want to show you upfront a table of contents for this video, because we'll cover a lot of subjects eventually. You may have questions or think I'm leaving out information and you'll rush to your keyboard to write a 2,000-word essay before you've heard everything. Just know we'll get to all these topics eventually. Finally, before we begin, I have 3 disclaimers for this video. 1, I am not here to tell you what to do. What you choose to read is entirely your business. I don't have any right to preach or moralize to you about this, but I do want to help you engage with offensive content and make informed choices about whatever you choose to read. 2nd, this will be an offensive video. It will probably offend everyone. Won't that be fun? But content warning for topics like racism, genocide, sexual assault, pedophilia, all that kind of thing. 3rd and finally, no hate speech please. Just because we're discussing offensive content does not mean it's open season to make hateful comments, because it's my channel and I don't like it.
Down here, I'm God.
What is hate speech? We'll get to that later. Finally, there's one major rule we need to establish. When I make a book review, I often flag if there's offensive content in the book, such as sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. Now thankfully, every time I discuss these politically sensitive topics on the internet, the comment section is always very courteous, very respectful and calm, and uses correct spelling. No, I'm kidding, they're freaking lunatics. But there is an assumption that if a book is offensive, it means it's poorly written, and the author is evil, and you're evil for liking it. But none of those things are true. For one, offensive content and the quality of writing are 2 very separate things. Often, offensive books are still very well written. Other times, they may over-rely on offensiveness and shocking content to make up for crappy writing, but they can pair together just fine. This means you may deeply enjoy a story that is also deeply offensive. Doesn't make you a bad person necessarily. It just means that books have multiple strengths and weaknesses that exist simultaneously in the same work. For example, one of my all-time favorite book series is The Dresden Files, even though the way it writes women tends to be overly sexualized. It's one of those, she breasted boobily down the stairs type thing. I love the strengths of the story, and I don't love the weaknesses of the story, but they both exist in the same book, and one doesn't cancel out the other, at least not for me. However, it is entirely possible for offensive content to impact the quality of writing in ways both positive and negative. Let me give you a few quick examples. It's by no means a comprehensive list, I just want to get you thinking about the link between these 2 things. 1, offensiveness can be distracting. Using the previous example of she breasted boobily down the stairs, it can be frustrating to try to read a good book when the author keeps describing women's bodies in weird ways, or something similar. This type of thing can take the reader out of the story very quickly. 2, some stories are better for being offensive. I know, stories that offer social commentary or discuss dark topics or confront war crimes and the macabre can challenge us in good ways. The uncomfortable content can allow for exploring deeper themes and meaning. Or writers can use offensive comedy to make us laugh. We'll come back to intentionally offensive content later. And number 3, another negative. Offensive can mean a lack of empathy. The hard truth is, you need empathy to be a good writer.
It's empathy time! Let's get decent!
Stories are fundamentally an empathetic experience. We are living through someone else's eyes. The writer's job is to invoke our empathy and make us care about these characters. You ever read a book where you just couldn't care about anyone in it? That's when the author failed to make us empathize. Stories don't function without it. So offensive stories can sometimes come from a lack of empathy, which in turn can lead to poor character writing, so there can be a connection. 4, stories can be too inoffensive. We get this in movies a lot when studios are trying so hard to avoid offending anyone, they end up making bland, lifeless, soulless movies that have no meaning whatsoever. I'm thinking of Disney's Pinocchio remake, where the boy Pinocchio literally never does anything wrong. It's so inoffensive that it undermines the whole point of the story of him learning from his mistakes and becoming a good boy. So it is entirely possible to go too far to the other extreme. So quality of writing and offensiveness can impact each other from time to time, but for the most part they are separate entities. One doesn't cancel out the other. So keep that in mind when we discuss offensive books, and remember that it doesn't automatically guarantee that the quality will be greater or lesser. Okay, the big core question we need to establish is: the obvious first answer to this question will be the type of thing you see in movies' content warnings, so graphic violence, sexual references, swearing, all that stuff. That's why warnings exist on movies and games, to avoid offending people. It can be extra offensive when the product is intended for younger audiences and the warning does not properly warn people of what's involved.
Think of the children. Won't somebody please think of the children?
And yet, offensive content is much more nuanced than just content warnings. In 1964, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart openly admitted that he could not come up with a precise definition for what constitutes hardcore pornography. But he said in a now famous line, "I know it when I see it." This popular phrase suggests that there are concepts that are more obscure and hard to pinpoint with an exact definition, and yet they can still be identified easily and quickly by the average person on a more instinctive level. Offensive content very much falls into this category. It's something we can recognize when it happens, even if we can't always put into words exactly how or why. It can be as simple as a gut feeling. This is part of the reason why offensiveness is so subjective and it's so heavily debated.
Basically, what I'm trying to say is trust your gut.
Still, there are some common areas and patterns that we can point to with certainty and call them offensive content. So let's go through a few of them. First one is hate speech. Yes, as we mentioned earlier. Hate speech is notoriously difficult to define. In fact, the United Nations has tried multiple times to write a legal definition of the term hate speech, but as of November 2025, all they have is a framework.
They're more like guidelines anyway.
The UN framework defines hate speech as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. Hate speech is closely connected with discrimination, and there's a lot of overlap between their content, targeting people based on who they are and what group they belong to. However, discrimination can be defined enough to become properly illegal. For example, hate speech might mean using a racial slur, but discrimination might mean firing someone based on their race. There's much more direct action. Discrimination is easy to prove because you can see tangible results, such as depriving one group of rights and privileges that are available to other groups. People can make lawsuits for discrimination and win court cases when they've been victimized. So is that how we define offensive content? Is it hate speech and discrimination? Well, not exactly, because it's entirely possible to single someone out for the category they belong to without being offensive. One of my favorite examples of this is Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Toph is blind, and there are so many blind jokes in the show.
Can't you watch where you're...
No.
Right.
Sorry.
Now clearly this is singling someone out for their disability, yet we can all tell it's not offensive. Can't we? We know it instinctively on a gut level that this feels totally fine. So what's the difference? Two things stand out to me with how Toph is written. It's not stereotyping and it's not derogatory. Let's discuss both of those things. I think stereotyping is the offensive content that I see most often. Authors often try to write characters from different demographics, but rely too much on lazy stereotypes, so it lacks authenticity. The characters' experiences don't feel lived in, but rather slapped on with an outsider's perspective.
That's just lazy writing.
And it's not just individuals either. Sometimes the author will write entire cultures and ideologies that are offensively inaccurate and filled with personal bias.
What do you mean, you people?
What do you mean, you people?
But Toph's blindness does not feel like a lazy stereotype. It feels like she's lived this experience every day. Realistic details such as how she can't read or write, how she doesn't care about her appearance, and how she constantly makes jokes about it, all feel specific enough to invoke some empathy in us. It's described from an insider's perspective, not an outsider. Stereotyping is actually a pretty normal thing to do. I know, just hear me out. Humans naturally try to process new incoming information by sorting it into our existing categories of knowledge. We like creating predictable patterns. The problem is that stereotypes are often inaccurate and make us resistant to new information. We often ignore information that doesn't fit the pattern we recognize, and if anything does fit that pattern, we see it as confirmation. Stereotyping can even be further divided into two categories: explicit and implicit, otherwise known as conscious or unconscious bias. Our explicit stereotypes are when we knowingly believe something about an entire group of people and we let it affect our decision making. It can be positive or negative. This form of prejudice is actually quite easy to recognize, but implicit stereotypes are much harder to spot in others and in ourselves. We can build images in our mind of other people based on class, culture, religion, or through outside influences such as media or online algorithms that reinforce our beliefs. We may believe a stereotype, yet genuinely think that we hold a factually based belief. These unconscious biases show up all the time in writing, and let me confess, as a writer, I've written stories in the past that have unknowingly revealed my own unconscious biases. When readers have pointed this out to me, I've had to stop, do some self-reflection on my beliefs, and then go educate myself on the reality of the situation. I'm pointing all of this out because a lot of authors will have their unconscious biases show up in their stories, and if you're a writer, it will absolutely happen to you too. It takes effort and ongoing work to be self-aware of our own prejudices. And it means that if we, as readers, find a book with offensive content, it doesn't necessarily mean that the author did it deliberately. Offensive content can be written unconsciously, and the author may need education on this matter. It's not always a sign that they're pure evil and they're pushing a prejudice on us by choice. But returning to everyone's favorite earthbender, Toph's blindness is also never derogatory. It's never putting her down or insulting her or making her seem less human. It never dehumanizes her, in fact, it humanizes her. This is an important distinction. You don't want to write a story at a person's expense. Write a story about a person's experiences so that they become relatable. That is humanizing storytelling. Okay, so we've established that offensive content is content warnings, hate speech, discrimination, stereotyping, and derogatory content. Does this finally cover it? Well, still no. Another type of offensive content is politicizing. Ooh, everyone's favorite. It's a very popular topic to argue about online. People critique stories and movies and my YouTube videos by saying all the time, why'd you have to make it political? Now, it's easy to dismiss this complaint offhand because everything's political these days, but it's still worth considering, because it's not just about politics. People fundamentally do not like it when a story starts preaching to them, when stories push an agenda or a message onto its audience. That said, the question of what is political content is an entirely different video. I'm not even going to begin to try to define the nuances there. So let's summarize and say politicization is when a story has a message that supports a partisan view. That inherent message can be seen as offensive content. And yet once again, I would argue that it's not always offensive. Take religion in books. In Narnia, the Christianity can be pretty damn heavy-handed and in-your-face about it, whereas in other stories like the Cosmere, religious themes are everywhere, but not so overt. Both are examples of politicization, but one is much more subtle. Plus, political themes can make a story more interesting, much like offensive content can too. I think it's a question of how it's included, and I have evidence to back this up. A recent study by researcher Stephen Follows analysed over 10,000 movies and 4 million movie reviews to see if films that were considered woke or anti-woke were successful or not. The study actually found that there was no conclusive proof one way or another. For every woke film that bombed, there were others that were successful, and vice versa. However, the study did find that movies that were heavy-handed in their messaging were almost always poorly received, whether they were woke or not. It's a fascinating study that suggests that people don't actually mind politicizing and messaging in stories. They just don't like it when it's so obvious that it becomes distracting.
I just want to watch my movie.
However, politicizing can be so offensive and polarizing that it leads to, shall we say, overreactions? You know how these days when a blockbuster movie features a woman or a person of color in the lead, and it sparks a lot of online complaints and cries of go woke, go broke, because minorities being featured in a prominent place is now perceived as an automatic message, as if their very existence is a threat. This is where the reaction to perceived politicization can get a bit out of hand.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are 2 of them.
There's one more type of offensive content I'll list today, and that is contradicting our worldview. Sometimes we encounter content that's not actually offensive, but simply different. It confronts us, it challenges us, and it contradicts how we see the world. That can be offensive. Here's a personal example of this. I was raised in a Christian home, and we often thought content on TV was deeply offensive if it promoted a non-Christian worldview. Things like teaching evolution, sexually explicit scenes, gay people, or using phrases like "oh my god" or "god damn." Deeply offensive. Now, of course, those things are not inherently anti-Christian, but they did confront my, at the time, worldview, and confrontation feels like an offensive attack. To be clear, this is not a religion-specific event. It happens constantly on the internet when we interact with people all across the world from different worldviews, different classes of wealth, different education levels, or different cultures. There is such a broad spectrum of beliefs out there. When we encounter something different, it can feel offensive, even though it's just different. But I am going to leave this here for now. So to summarize the question of what is offensive content, we've established that it can be content warnings, hate speech, discrimination, stereotyping, derogatory content, politicizing, and contradicting our worldview. This list is non-exhaustive, and I feel like I've only begun to scratch the surface. The truth is, there is something out there that will offend everyone. Yes, even you. Now let's look at how we can engage with this type of content, thinking it through on a critical level to try to understand it fully. Critical reading is a form of analysis where you try to understand every layer of meaning in a text. It means doing more than reading just the surface level. This is where you examine the content further and go deeper. Look for supporting points and counterpoints too. Spot flaws in the author's line of reason or areas where it's vague. Critical reading also means to avoid biased judgment, so identify biases, either the author's or your own, and instead study the text rationally and skeptically. It's about being informed by evidence in order to make accurate conclusions. If you want a precise definition of critical reading, something that might be helpful is information from the organization Insight Assessment. They literally have a critical thinking test called the CCTDI, because they believe a standard IQ test does not accurately measure your ability to process information. This critical thinking test measures performance in 7 categories: truth-seeking, open-mindedness, analyticity or foresight, systematicity or focus, confidence in reasoning, inquisitiveness, and cognitive maturity. So that's perhaps one way to measure critical reading ability. But to simplify it all even further to its bare bones, critical reading means to ask questions. That's one of the best ways to employ critical reading. So here are a bunch of questions we can ask ourselves if we encounter offensive content, and hopefully this will get you thinking. First, is this individually offensive or universally offensive? There is a huge chasm between what offends one person and what offends another, yet we tend to assume that our standards for offensiveness is the one and wholly correct standard, and everyone else is wrong. If it offends me, it's because it's legitimate. If it only offends you, well, it's because you're an idiot. But the standards of offense are a vast spectrum that's heavily subjective. In fact, it's a lot like driving a car. Everyone assumes that their way of driving is the correct way. 5k's under, 5k's over, the speed limit. The fact is, everyone has their own style, even within the boundaries of the road rules, as frustrating as that can be. This is one of the biggest problems I encounter whenever I try to have a discourse about offensive content. Everyone assumes that their standard is the only one. But there's just no way to apply a universal rule to this sort of thing. This is important to remember if you're a writer or a content creator of any kind. It is impossible to please everyone.
Well, you can certainly try.
There will always be those who don't like you or your work. Some days all you can do is try your best and, of course, try not to discriminate. Still, when we see offensive content, we need to acknowledge that other people might just have a different reaction. It may be a universal offensiveness or purely individually based. People are allowed their own reactions, and if someone did have a different reaction to me, perhaps that's something I could learn more about. Next question, do I understand this topic correctly? God, I wish more people asked this question. If two people disagree about whether a story is offensive or not, it is entirely possible one of them just does not understand the topic correctly. Imagine if a woman says, "This book is offensive to women," and then a man shows up and goes, "No, it's not." Well, there's a very good chance that the man is not familiar with the female experience or with harmful gender stereotypes or misogyny, that sort of thing. This also applies to people of color, to historical context, or cultural depictions. Often we're not offended because we just didn't understand the significance of what was being said. So it's important to listen to people who have different reactions to you. Consider why they have that reaction, and if it's something you should research further to expand your own knowledge base. Now, perhaps the most important question, how is it framed? I encounter this one all the time on my channel. The issue is not, is the content offensive, but instead, how is it being presented to the audience?
I didn't do it. I've been framed. Waka waka.
The framing of the issue can completely change how it's perceived and whether or not it's offensive. I'm a tad passionate about this one, so if you'll indulge me on an elaborate example, let's take a look at the topic of slavery. Slavery is a heavy topic that needs some very careful handling if it's going to work in a story. This is where the framing is especially important, because it relates to real people and real history, but a story is not automatically offensive for having slavery in it. For example, the film 12 Years a Slave is a brutal depiction on the horrors and atrocities perpetuated by slavery. There's kidnappings, abuse, and rape. But the film constantly frames the topic of slavery as clearly a bad thing. So I think we can all say this is not offensive, despite it being a sensitive topic. Then we have the other extreme, Tarzan of the Apes. While we're all pretty familiar with the concept of Tarzan, most have not read the original novel published in 1912. The book is heavily saturated with themes of hereditary gifts and racial superiority. You see, Tarzan spends much of the first book fighting an African tribe, and those people are described as being cannibals, rapists, and as being no better than the apes in the book. And Tarzan is not king of the jungle because he's a hero. No, he rises to the top because of the racial superiority of his English aristocratic breeding. The idea being that if you drop an upper-class white man into any situation, he will naturally rise to the top. So, at the end of that book, a French platoon of soldiers invade the tribal village and shoot dead every single adult male, sparing only the children and any women who did not take up arms against them. So it's a massacre. How is this framed by the book? As a resounding victory. An antagonist has been defeated and Tarzan finally has revenge on his hated enemy. It's a satisfying end. Now, full disclosure, I studied this book years ago in university, and I could have sworn that the French soldiers enslaved the rest of the African tribe, but in fact checking the script, it turns out I just misremembered. The soldiers actually left all the survivors behind. So this book does not technically frame slavery as a good thing, but I'm still including it here as an example of racially based subjugation and colonial violence being framed as a good thing. So those are both extremes of framing, and yet framing is much more nuanced than is it good or bad. There's a whole spectrum in between. So a midpoint example would be the 2000 film The Patriot, where slavery is constantly avoided as a topic. It's almost never mentioned, and certainly not confronted in any meaningful way. In fact, there's a scene where the British offer freedom to the African Americans who join their army, but then the men reply that they're not slaves, they're hired laborers working for pay. This scene, and others like it, drew criticism at the time for downplaying the severity and the widespread use of slavery during this time. And yes, I am aware of that one plotline where a slave joins the American army to earn his freedom, yet even that plotline avoids mentioning what he went through as a slave. The harsher elements are skimmed over. This framing is just avoiding the topic entirely. It's also called whitewashing. Now, I know whitewashing has multiple meanings, and these days it tends to mean casting only white people in a film. But the dictionary definition of whitewashing is to deliberately attempt to cover up or conceal incriminating information. You might also call this erasure, so pretending the problem and the people affected by it simply never existed. Framing an offensive topic by not mentioning it at all can itself be offensive. A fourth and final example of framing is downplaying a problem. I call this the not so bad framing. An example of this would be the slavery in the Lightbringer series. Now, remember I said earlier that books can be offensive and still be very well written? This is case in point. I love the flintlock magic system here, but I've reviewed that series in the past and talked about its problematic content, and thankfully everyone was calm and respectful and courteous. No, I'm kidding. So this book has a ton of slavery in it, but it's always depicted as not that bad. The prime example is our protagonist Gavin, who is essentially a god emperor. Gavin has a room slave, Mauricia, and she's his secretary, his cleaner, and his sexual slave who meets all of his sexual needs. But the story frames this as being okay because Gavin is nice to her and Mauricia genuinely loves him.
Okay, but that's worse. I mean, you do get how that's worse.
This example takes the topic of slavery and downplays how bad it was. In the book, Mauricia is happy, and she has a good life. It presents this as the reality of what slavery was. It also skims over the fact that she has no freedom at all, and Gavin has total and absolute power over her. But it's okay, because he's a good slave owner. So, those are 4 elaborate examples of framing to show you how it works. And sorry, I acknowledge that I over-explained that one a bit, but it's an important question we should ask ourselves if we're going to read critically. How is the offensive content framed? And is that framing humanizing people or dehumanizing people, or somewhere in between? The next question, is it offensive intentionally? Yes, there are stories that are supposed to be offensive. This includes hyper-violent shows like The Boys or Game of Thrones. Stories that are supposed to shock you with sudden, jarring, dark content that goes way over the top. Like, it's culturally well known at this point that in the first 5 minutes of The Boys, someone explodes. And in The Red Wedding, a pregnant woman gets stabbed. Like, it's horrid and confronting, but that's the point. These types of offensive content are all about subverting the niceties that often surround storytelling. It's a gritty, more realistic worldview that is unforgiving and punishes the naive. Now yes, there are of course stories that have gratuitous violence for the sake of the gratuity, but others use it as part of the story. The offensiveness is kind of the point. Another example is comedy shows, like Family Guy or South Park. So here's a fun little story for you. My wife and I recently double booked our weekend plans. My younger brother was visiting on the same day as my mother-in-law. My brother wanted to continue his watch through of South Park, and he just so happened to be up to the final episode starring Chef, an episode that has about 50 jokes about pedophilia. Ugh. My brother and I are on the couch, red in the face, trying not to laugh, while my mother-in-law is just sitting there watching in judgment. It was like that Monty Python skit, you know, with Biggest Dickus.
Dickus?
But why the hell does an episode like that even exist? Isn't that extremely offensive? Well, the point of that particular episode was a critique of the Church of Scientology, since that organization has had multiple accusations and lawsuits against them for abuse, sexual crimes, and even human trafficking. It's pretty extreme. In this case, South Park used extremely offensive humor to make a point, to mock a powerful organization and to call them out on their corruption.
Screw you guys. I'm going home.
This is one of the best uses of humor and of art and of free will itself. Through the art of satire, we can mock the powerful, expose their hypocrisies, and even limit their power. It is legitimately one of the best ways to preserve democratic freedoms and human rights. And it's a red flag of authoritarianism if a government ever tries to silence and suppress this type of art. Now, of course, it's not always such a noble thing. Sometimes stories are just offensive on purpose because of lazy writing, relying on shock value more than anything actually funny. Yet I think Terry Pratchett said it best when describing satire. Satire is meant to ridicule power. If you are laughing at people who are hurting, it's not satire, it's bullying. So that's an important question. Is the intentionally offensive content punching up or punching down? Next question we've got to ask ourselves. Am I being influenced? This is always a good question we should ask ourselves when we're engaging with any sort of media, because everything is trying to influence us. The world is saturated right now with information, misinformation, and disinformation, pulling us in different directions. In many ways, we're always being influenced. The trick is to do so consciously, not unconsciously. Choose the types of things we want to be influenced by. Factually based information, or education that makes us smarter, for example. Offensive content will influence us too. We'll discuss how in just a second with the pros and cons of reading it, but just know that critical reading is all about analyzing the information we're being presented with in order to ensure that what we're believing is correct. This means being skeptical of influence and being intentional about what we choose to believe. There's one final question I want to suggest to you. Who is affected? People often say, I was not offended by this, when they're not the person or the group who's been depicted offensively. We need to ask ourselves who is affected and how. This is a good opportunity for further research. If you see a racial stereotype in a story, you may think, this doesn't offend me, but it may be worth seeing what people from that race are saying about their depiction, and listen to their stories, and follow their example on how to react. You can go check out websites about certain people for further information, or follow content creators and voices within that sphere. Learn how people are being affected. Okay, that's enough critical reading questions. As you can see, there's lots of ways that we can analyze and evaluate information in what we're reading, and my list of questions is just a starting point to get you thinking. But let's move on from here and discuss perhaps the most important question of this entire topic. There are several possible ways we can react when we encounter offensive content. Let's go through them and see what our options are. Now keep in mind what I said at the start. I'm trying really hard to not tell you what to do at any point in this video, but you may find some of these reactions seem better than others. I swear that's not me pushing that option. Reaction 1. Avoidance. If the book or movie is offensive, we stop engaging with it immediately. We put it down and walk away forever. Now this might seem like the coward's option, but it's legitimate, especially if you're someone who faces discrimination frequently in your real life. You probably don't want to experience it further when you're seeking out entertainment. Reaction 2. Canceling. Cancel the book, the author, and anyone who likes it. That's always an option. Now look, cancel culture has many vocal critics, and every damn influencer wants to have an opinion on it, including me. Cancel culture is an attempt by common people to hold the rich and powerful to account for their actions, since we accept that the law isn't going to do it for us. Canceling is a way for the people to use our democratic power to get justice.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest.
But some of the challenges faced by cancel culture is that it's like trying to do surgery with a blunt force instruments. It lacks room for nuance and misunderstanding. It's also very limited in what it can do. We can cancel famous individuals, but boycotting powerful corporations that actually do so much harm? That's a little trickier. Still, cancelling is an option we can take. If you find offensive content, you can fully block it, never engage with it again, never give the creator any of your money, and encourage others to do so too. That is absolutely an option. Reaction 3, dismiss. It's a very common reaction. We see something offensive and ignore it. We read on past it, we brush it off like it's not that big a deal. The dismissive reaction allows us to continue to enjoy good stories. And it doesn't necessarily mean we agree with all that offensive content, it's just that we don't want to think about it right now. The downsides of this reaction is that we don't fully engage with the meaning in the text, and it can limit our own understanding of these matters. Reaction 4, downplay. This is where you argue against the offensiveness and pretend it's not that big a deal. You're just a big baby, it's not that offensive, and you can't say anything these days. I sometimes call this the shoot the messenger reaction, because it often involves just straight up attacking the person who called something offensive in the first place. It also means rationalizing the problem to try to make it sound insignificant. This reaction often presents itself as being very intellectual, but also avoids sincerely engaging with the ideas. Reaction 5, contextualize. This is where we put the offensive content back into the context from whence it came.
Now put that thing back where it came from, or so help me!
This typically happens with older stories. We say it's a product of its time. An example would be the Tarzan book I mentioned earlier. Contextualizing Tarzan means acknowledging that its message of racial superiority was written in the American South during the 1910s, when the area was seeing massive immigration from non-white people. It led to fear-mongering that white culture would be destroyed. So the author wrote an inspiring story about how white culture would triumph even in the most extreme circumstances. Yeah, as you can see, contextualizing doesn't necessarily make the situation any better, but it's still a useful way to fully comprehend what's going on in the text so that you don't take it at face value. Contextualizing is a very important part of critical reading. However, I do find many people contextualize as a lazy way to avoid thinking about the content fully. They contextualize in order to dismiss it, not to understand it. Reaction 6, research further. I wish this one was more popular. If you find something offensive, go research that topic further on your own. Find an expert to listen to, read other literature, listen to podcasts, follow creators and thinkers on social media so that you're exposed further to their ideas. It's so easy to become reliant on whatever information naturally appears on our social media feed, or your YouTube suggestions. But remember that the selection process for what information is presented to you will always have a bias. So learn to be self-reliant on your own education, feed your algorithm, and practice studying further on your own. It's the best way to keep yourself informed. Reaction 7, critical reading. Yeah, okay, so obviously this is the one I want you to do, but I'm trying to be objective about it. As we've discussed elsewhere, this reaction is where you examine all the information in front of you in great detail. You compare it to other texts, you read it with skepticism and objectivity, using logic and reason to unpack the topic and understand it fully. Although there is a common failing with critical thinking, believe it or not, where sometimes people will just be skeptical and critical of everything and assume that's doing it right. They simply doubt everything and believe nothing. And that's not the point. The goal of critical thinking is to seek the truth. And at a certain point, you need to actually accept information when it can be proven. So there, in the pursuit of objectivity, there was a negative against critical reading. Ta-da! But there's one final reaction we gotta talk about. Reaction 8, absorb. This is the one I don't want you to do. This is where we accept the offensive content, absorb it, and allow it to influence what we believe. For example, we may see something on Instagram that's offensive against women, and then go, haha, yeah, women suck. It's shallow, it's reactionary, it's ignorant, but it's a common problem we see on the internet. I mean, maybe not for all you clever dorks who watch a video essay, but in my opinion, this is how most people respond to offensive content. You may disagree with me here, that's fine, but I genuinely think this is the most common response. For the record, I did a whole video on propaganda and how it influences us, and that's worth checking out if you want to know more about how we absorb information. So, those are our possible reactions, and ultimately I hope that you will be delighted deliberate with whatever reaction you have to offensive content. Now, let's address the actual title of this video, Should We Read Offensive Books? And let's look at what happens when we do. What are the pros and cons of engaging with offensive content? Because there are absolutely pros and cons. Let's go through a few. Pro number one, it's like exposure therapy. Exposure therapy allows people to experience their anxieties and confront their traumas in a safe environment. It breaks patterns of avoidance, where sometimes avoiding the issue for so long makes it debilitating. Confrontation allows people to overcome their fears. As a side note, this is why people often watch horror movies, because it helps us to become accustomed to feeling fear and to gain back our bravery. Well, dealing with offensive content has a very similar effect to this. It allows us to acclimatize to these dark topics and grow more comfortable in facing them. This can be advantageous. After all, the world around us is filled with offensive things. I'm offended by fascism and war crimes and journalistic malpractice. And if we can't face the reality of these problems, then how can we work to solve them? Sometimes we need to have the courage to look a problem right in the eye. And being exposed to offensive content can help us build a stronger constitution and allow us to face bigger challenges. Pro number two, it's educational. Offensive content can help to educate us on important topics. We recently discussed The Handmaid's Tale, a book that's all about a totalitarian regime and the extreme restriction of human rights, especially on women's reproductive rights. These are offensive topics, but it's very beneficial for us to learn about them and how they impact the real world. Pro number three, mockery. We touched on this earlier, but offensive content can be used as a tool of mockery for multiple useful purposes. For one, we can mock people in power in order to limit their influence and even preserve the rights of the general population. Now, many people take issue with mocking governments and influencers and billionaires because it seems so unkind. But it's actually an effective way to hold these people accountable for how they use their power and ultimately remind them of the power of democracy.
Democracy manifest.
Also, we can mock ideas and ideologies and belief systems, and in doing so expose some of their logical fallacies. This may be unflattering and also deeply offensive, but it's also an effective way to test the legitimacy of an idea. Like the popular saying, the truth can withstand scrutiny. Mock the belief and see if it still holds up. And pro number four, a morbid enjoyment. No one likes to admit it, but sometimes we engage with offensive content because it's just sick and disgusting and kind of fun.
Disgusting! Love that!
The gratuitous violence, the debauchery, the shock value of it all, it can all be a guilty pleasure. It doesn't mean we want to run out there and do all of these things for real, but it appeals to the darker side of human nature. That's why horror movies can be so enjoyable. Sometimes we just want to watch a person get horrifically mutilated. No one's going to be offended.
That's why I'm here.
There's also an element of psychology to this here. People sometimes watch true crime documentaries or real footage on the dark web of disturbing things, and we do it as a coping mechanism. If we feel anxious but there's no present danger around us, well then we go and watch something disturbing in order to create a danger, in order to justify and appease our anxiety. It's so we can point and go like, that's where the anxiety is coming from. It's not the healthiest coping mechanism, but it's one many people use. Okay, I'm sure there are more pros I could mention. Let me know if you think I've missed an important one, but let's move on and look at the cons. Con number one, desensitization. The more we see offensive content, the less offensive it becomes. It loses its shock value. This means that we can see so much extreme violence in stories that we may now see nothing wrong with witnessing extreme violence in real life or see it depicted on the news. It all blurs into one blob of nothing. Seen one beheading, seen them all, right? This can be a slippery slope. Imagine hearing so many jokes about violent crime that you become desensitized. Suddenly, violence doesn't seem like that big a deal anymore. After all, we know that many criminals have a escalating pattern of violence. They start out torturing animals and then gain confidence to go up to people. Now, I know this may all seem like an extreme example, but there are absolutely individuals who move through the stages of desensitization to petty crime to violent crime. Even if this only happens one time out of 100, it's still a factor worth considering. Is that a culture we take part in? Con number 2, it numbs empathy. Too much offensive content can make it hard to care about anything. This is one of the reasons why depression is so high these days, because it's hard to care and easier to shut down. Our empathy gets numbed as a coping mechanism because that's how we learn to survive overwhelming negative emotions. Overexposure to dark content can keep us trapped in a numbed state. Con number 3, it influences us. We are always being influenced by the world around us, as we've said before, so it's an important life skill to practice being aware of where that influence is coming from and not getting swept up in what others want us to believe. Yet, offensive content can influence us too, in our perceptions of what's normal, what's acceptable, what's tolerable. Unless we read critically, we will likely absorb some of the content we see and allow it to change what we think. Con number 4, radicalization. There has been some disturbing trends of widespread radicalization, particularly among young men. It can include the glorification of violence and hate speech. We have popular influencers that target young men and openly teach that offensive content is a sign of strength and maturity, that cruelty is for the strong, that offensiveness is a masculine trait. This is just really f***ing stupid. But it's an alarming global trend. So remember that if we engage with offensive content in books and film, we may be contributing to the popularity of that sort of content and be seen as endorsing the radicalization message. Final con number 5, ethical consumption. People are becoming more aware of the flow of commerce. We track where we spend our money and who it goes to. This is because there are a lot of nasty corporations and powerful individuals who use that money for nefarious purposes. So if we read offensive books, we can run the risk of giving our money to an offensive person. Or we show movie executives that offensive movies make money, therefore they should go and make more offensive movies. We have to ask, where does the money go? There are more pros and cons than this, and I'm sure you can let me know. But as you can see, I'm not telling you if you should read offensive books or not, because I'm not answering that question for you. Only you can answer that. In all of this long video, there have been 3 major topics that just didn't fit anywhere else, and I'm going to clumsily tack them on the end. So if we're going to read offensive books, we have 3 last things to consider. What about offensive authors? Yikes, what a minefield of a topic to save to the end. But I swear, when I consider reviewing a book on my channel these days, I need to do a full background check on the author first, every single time. As an example, I recently brought all 5 books in the Belgariad series by David Eddings, and then realized that David Eddings literally went to jail for abusing foster kids. Yeah, a police officer found a 4-year-old boy in a cage in his basement, in the dark, covered in bruises and starving. Like, what the f***? So yeah, there are some offensive authors out there. Now, most of you will already have a fully formed opinion about offensive authors, so I'm not going to get too into it, but I want to talk to you about the David Eddings example, because I've been considering for a few months now if I still want to read his books. So here are 3 questions I've been asking myself that I'll share with you. First, is the author actively hurting others now? Consider, are they hurting others now, or are they speaking a harmful opinion, or are they silent on important issues? Because there is a spectrum of harm you can participate in. Just having an opinion is very different to actively hurting other people right now. So in this case, David Eddings died 16 years ago, so he's not actively abusing kids. Literally a point in its favor. Second, are they receiving your money? Because money buys power and influence. If you're unsure if you want this author to grow more powerful, well then you can read their books without giving money to terrible people. Buy books secondhand, and then the evil author doesn't get a cent. Just saying. And third, are you giving them attention? Consider the Streisand effect, where trying to remove something can cause it to surge in popularity. In 2003, Barbra Streisand tried to sue a photographer for $50 million for taking this photo of her mansion. The photo was actually part of a government study about the dangers of the eroding coastline, and her photo was just one out of 12,000 other photos. The lawsuit led to the image being widely circulated, and she lost the court case, because sometimes taking a stance can cause the issue to become more popular and widespread. If you really want to oppose an author and what they stand for, consider if silence would be a better option. There are authors I personally choose to boycott, and I simply don't talk about them. So consider these questions regarding how we engage with offensive authors, and consider that in light of all the critical reading information we've discussed so far. Even then, there's still no simple answer. I'm personally still a bit unsure about the David Eddings situation. But now here's another topic we haven't covered. A question of censorship. The book community is very active in denouncing book banning. And yet, if we start avoiding offensive books, isn't that a bit like book banning? Isn't it a bit hypocritical? What about freedom of speech? Well, there can be a fine line between avoiding offensiveness and outright book banning, so here's 3 more things to consider. 1. Freedom of speech is not the same as freedom to be heard. Because you have freedom to be heard in certain instances, like your government, that's what democratic representatives are for, or freedom to be heard by the law so that you have legal rights. But you don't have freedom to be heard by everyone else when you're expressing an opinion.
Why won't you listen to me?
This means people should absolutely be free to write offensive books, but no one has to read them. Avoiding offensive books is not the same as silencing an author and preventing their book from being available. Second, you can't make people do anything. As we've established, offensiveness can be subjective and everyone is entitled to their own standard. You can't force people to respond the same way that you would. You gotta let people make their own decisions. You can educate and advocate, but ultimately you gotta back off. So censoring books and making decisions on other people's behalf will only cause problems. And third, consider the paradox of tolerance. This is a philosophical concept that suggests that if society gives freedom and tolerance to all people, there will eventually be those who will use that power to take away freedom and tolerance from others. This has happened several times in history with dictators, fascism, and religious extremists. The paradox of tolerance cautions us that we should give freedom and tolerance to all people, but we should also be prepared to defend it from those who use that power for evil. So we need to learn how to tell the difference between someone who just has an offensive opinion and someone who wants to take away basic human rights from other people. Yeah, those who subvert human rights need to be opposed. You may even use the word censored. So while I don't think we should be censoring authors, I would argue that there is a time and place for opposition. When authors try to take away human rights from other people, that's the point we should step in and oppose them. That is the paradox of tolerance. One final topic for today. Consider the language of genocide. The organization Genocide Watch defines the 10 stages of genocide, showing that there is a process and a build-up before mass violence occurs. You may find that many of these early stages of the process focus on language. Genocides always begin with the process of dehumanization, classifying a group of people as subhuman and undeserving of human rights. Throughout history, targeted groups have been called cockroaches or vermin. This language contributes to changing people's minds and radicalizing them against others. It allows ideas and sentiments to turn into violent action. You may think that this is a very extreme example, but there is a long list of genocides that have occurred in just the last century, a long, depressing list with many events that aren't even widely known. Plus, the Genocide Watch organization has identified 4 emergency situations in the world today where genocide is actively being perpetrated in Sudan, the Congo, Myanmar, and Gaza. All of these start with dehumanizing language. This is where art and entertainment have a real tangible effect. Our stories, our books, our films all have the power to humanize people and advocate for their rights, or to do the opposite, to participate in the process of dehumanization. So this is the final question I want you to consider today. Is the offensive content I engage with participating in the process of dehumanization? We've covered a lot of content today, so let's summarize what we've learned. Number 1, the quality of a book is separate to its offensiveness. Number 2, offensiveness is subjective, but can include such things as graphic content, hate speech, discrimination, stereotyping, derogatory content, politicizing, and contradictions of our worldview. Number 3, critical reading allows us to examine the text beyond its surface level and consider things with objectivity and skepticism and a questioning attitude. Number 4, we should consider questions such as, is it individually or universally offensive? Do I understand this topic correctly? How is it framed? Is the offense intentional? Am I being influenced? And who is affected? Number 5, we can react to this content in several ways: avoid, cancel, dismiss, downplay, contextualize, research, critical reading, or absorb. Number 6, pros of engaging with offensive content include exposure therapy, educational, mockery, and a morbid enjoyment. Number 7, cons of engaging with offensive content include desensitization, numbing empathy, being influenced, radicalization, and unethical consumption. And number 8, we should also consider if the author is offensive, if we're participating in censorship, or promoting the language of genocide. So, should we read offensive books? Ultimately, that is entirely your choice. No one has the right to make that choice for you, so read whatever you want. But think as you read.